this is O'Connor, and welcome to Forensic Accounting, or as the textbook calls, fraud examination. And we're going to learn all about the different types of fraud. In this video, we're going to just cover the nature of fraud, which is chapter 1 of the top hexagon we've got above us. So the nature of fraud, chapter 1. Wow. So after studying this chapter, you're going to understand the seriousness of fraud. We're going to define fraud. Now remember, I'll define it simply for you. Fraud is not bank robbery. Fraud is deception. Okay, so fraud is a bank robber going into the bank and no one being able to see the bank robber take the loot. But bank robberies, you can see them in broad daylight. So bank robbery is not fraud. So fraud is stealing by deception. Wow. All right, you're going to understand the difference between fraud committed against an organization and fraud committed on behalf of an organization. Yes, you can actually commit fraud on behalf of the organization you are working for. Amazing, amazing. Understand the difference between criminal and civil fraud laws and understand the types of fraud fighting careers are available today. Now, each of these issues we will be expanding in the different chapters as we go through this unit. So let's have a look at the fraud statistics and the sources. You can learn about fraud from government agencies, researchers, insurance companies, and also victims of fraud. And you're going to hear about victims of fraud, especially when they do civil lawsuits or they go into court and are witnesses to different frauds. The seriousness of the fraud problem. US organizations lose 5% of annual revenues to fraud. 3.5 trillion. That is a lot of losses out there. And they do say that for every dollar that you lose to fraud, you've got to make 10 times that amount in sales afterwards to counteract that cost of fraud. Wow. So is it better to have a strategy for reducing fraud or a strategy for increasing sales by 10 times? I think the former is what we should be focusing on, but you'll get this as we go through this unit. Wow. All right. So what is fraud? As I said earlier, it is not bank robbery because there is basically a deception. It's a representation about a material point. And the third item is most important, that is false. So it's a deception. It is a con. And it's believed by the victim, and it's acted upon by the victim to the victim's damage. Wow. So that's what we mean by fraud. It is deception, opposite to bank robbery, which is totally in the daylight, where you get to see the robbery take place. With fraud, you do not get to see the act of theft taking place. Not unless you're doing some undercover investigation, which you'll learn about in the later chapters of this unit. So this is the exciting thing about the unit. Now, who's this guy here? This is one of the first fraudsters of the last century, and that is Charles Ponzi. He basically duped investors into giving him money. We're talking up to $15 million. This is back in 1920s. That's a lot. We're talking about 150, $200 million in today's terms. And with the promise of returns, and those returns were paid out by more investors giving him money, but it all unraveled and he ended up going to jail. Wow, Charles Ponzi. So we know Ponzi because whenever another Ponzi scheme sets up, like the Bernie Madoff scheme in the late 2008, 9 and 10, we call it a Ponzi scheme, whereas Madoff was getting lovely returns for his investors, and those returns were coming from new investments, not from the earnings of the original investments themselves. Ponzi scheme. So we all know about that. Is a fraud against investors. It is a fraud against individuals of society. So confidence, deception. In order for me to deceive you, I need to get you to believe what I have to say. I need you to have confidence in what I'm going to promise to you. Confidence in my promise. So that's why I'm called a con man if I'm out to deceive you. Con being short for confidence. Wow. So the types of fraud, we can define them in terms of asset misappropriation, fraudulent financial statements, and corruption. So the first type is employee fraud, skimming, larceny, and disbursement. We're going to find out all about that mid-semester. Earnings management. This is on behalf of the organization, And then corruption, which is conflicts of interest, bribery, kickbacks, illegal gratuities, and extortion, of all things. Wow. All right. Now, we could classify fraud according to victims, where the organisation is the victim, and that is employee embezzlement or vendor fraud or customer fraud. Or we can talk about where the shareholders are the victims and management are out there committing fraud on behalf of the organisation, which we call financial statement fraud, earnings management. Then there are other types like investment scams, consumer frauds, and miscellaneous frauds that we're going to hear all about. Wow. So here are the different types. We've got employee embezzlement, vendor fraud, customer fraud. The first three are against organisations or are against individuals. The fourth one, this is your earnings management, where the management are committing fraud on behalf of the organisation to pretend it has higher profits than what it really has, and then shareholders are being duped. That is the owners of the organisation. Wow. And then there's other types like investment scams and miscellaneous types of fraud that we'll pick up near the end of semester. What about employee embezzlement, like the first type of fraud against an organisation? Well, we can talk about occupational fraud, which is most common. Employees steal the company's asset, which is direct or indirect, and the examples of direct and indirect are given in Chapter 1. But note this, basically, there are three types of fraud committed by employees against the organisation. That is incoming money fraud, that is skimming. There are established money and asset fraud, which is already an organisation, called larceny, and then there's outgoing fraud, which we call disbursement fraud. So incoming, established monies, and outgoing. You're going to learn all about that this semester. Wow. And we talk about vendor fraud, fraud committed by vendors acting alone or in collusion with buyers and vendors. We can talk about this being related to the supply chain. That is, vendors being the suppliers of the organisation, or it could be vendors being downstream distributors of the organisation. And usually it results in an overcharge for purchased goods, shipment of inferior goods, and non-shipment of goods through though payment is made. Wow. All right. So we've got customer fraud, and this is where customers do bad against an organisation, like a bank customer. Example in the textbook here. All right. A bank customer walked in a large bank and convinced the branch manager to give her a $500,000 cashier's check when she only had $13,000 in the account. Now you're saying that's crazy. That branch manager should be fired. Yeah, I agree. But these things happen. And what you're going to learn this semester is what things do we need to put in place to prevent these types of things from happening. Management fraud, again, earnings management. You heard all about Enron, WorldCom, Sunbeam, the big frauds at the turn of the century, investment and other consumer fraud. And there's more like that going on these days with internet scams, online scams, and so forth, SMS scams, and maybe you have been scammed at one stage or another. So we're going to talk about some of these issues. Criminal and civil prosecution of fraud. That's another issue where a civil proposition of criminal and civil prosecution of fraud. This is where under criminal law, you are righting a wrong against society, and the offence is that the person has to go to jail or maybe fined. All right. Whereas civil law is righting the violation of private rights of an individual, and therefore the damages is not sending someone to jail. The damages is paying you back as the victim. All right. Two different things. You can fight as a victim of fraud, both a criminal case and a civil case, but not normally at the same time. It's one before the other. So the big question I have for you, you're going to learn this semester, is which one do you go with first? Wow. And then we got various distinctions between civil cases and criminal cases. How to prepare for being a fraud fighting professional? Well, you need lots of analytical skills, communication skills, and technology skills. And there are other skills associated with understanding accounting books, understanding different audit, internal control approaches to preventing fraud, understanding how to do undercover investigations. Wow, very dangerous. So be careful about that. So there's all different ways in which you can have a career in fighting fraud. And they call these different careers in terms of accounting professionals, corporate security officers, expert witnesses, government inspectors, independent consultants, auditors, investigators, law enforcement, and most famous ones of all, lawyers. Yes, you know what I'm talking about. All right, so fraud related careers, as I said, you could get a job in a CPA firm, corporations consulting, and law firms. So what we're going to learn this semester are the nuts and bolts of all the different types of fraud that can be committed. You're also going to learn about what things we need to have put in place to prevent fraud from occurring in the first place. And then after it has occurred, what systems or procedures you're going to follow to try and detect the fact that fraud has taken place. And once you've detected fraud, what are you going to do to investigate who is responsible for that fraud? And finally, how are you going to prosecute the fraud, either criminally or civilly? There we have 4 steps in the fraud process, prevention, the detection, the investigation, and finally the prosecution of the fraud. There you have it. This is O'Connor. This is chapter 1. I've taken you through it quickly. Have a great read of it because it's only going to get better as we get into this semester, and see you in the classroom or online. Bye for now.